One morning in 1980, an entire side of a mountain tore loose and slid away in the largest landslide ever recorded on Earth. And the moment it did, it uncorked a blast of superheated gas and rock that came screaming out sideways faster than a jet airliner, and flattened a forest the size of a city in less than the time it takes to read this sentence. Trees that had stood for centuries, whole hillsides of them, were snapped off at the base and laid flat on the ground like matchsticks, all pointing away from the mountain, for miles in every direction. In minutes, a living, breathing landscape of forest and lakes and rivers became a gray, smoking, silent wasteland, buried under ash and rock, with nothing moving and nothing alive as far as anyone could see. The scientists who came to study it were certain of one thing: this place was dead. Not damaged, dead. They believed that life would have to crawl back in slowly from the green edges far away, creeping inward across the ash over decades, maybe a human lifetime, before this gray desert would be a living forest again. They came expecting to watch a slow funeral. They were wrong, because when they looked closely at that supposedly dead zone, something was already alive out there in the ash, and the first life to come back did not creep in from the edges at all. It came up, out of the ground, from underneath the destruction, in a way that rewrote what scientists thought they knew about how nature recovers from total catastrophe. The mountain is Mount Saint Helens in Washington State, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Before that morning, it was a nearly perfect cone, a snow-capped volcano surrounded by thick evergreen forest, cold clear lakes, and rivers full of fish. It looked eternal, the kind of mountain you assume will simply always be there. But underneath, magma had been pushing upward for weeks, swelling one whole flank of the mountain outward into an enormous bulge, straining it like a blister ready to burst. When that bulge finally gave way, the flank collapsed, and the entire top and side of the mountain came down at once. That collapse is what released the sideways blast, because with the weight of the mountain suddenly gone, the pressurized gas and molten rock inside exploded outward. The blast cloud was not just hot. It was hundreds of degrees, moving at hundreds of miles an hour, carrying rock and ash, and it obliterated almost everything in its path. Closest to the mountain, even the tree stumps were scoured away. A little further out, the forest was flattened. Further still, the trees were left standing but scorched to death. A gray forest of the dead. Ash buried the land. Rivers of mud and debris roared down the valleys. Lakes were choked and reshaped, and 57 people lost their lives. There is a detail from that day that captures the sheer scale of it. Near the mountain sat a large body of water called Spirit Lake, a calm forest lake ringed by trees and holiday cabins. The blast and the landslide hit it with such force that water was thrown hundreds of feet up the surrounding slopes, and when it crashed back, it dragged tens of thousands of shattered trees into the lake. For years afterward, a vast raft of dead logs floated on the surface of Spirit Lake, a drifting graveyard of an entire forest, moving slowly back and forth with the wind. If you wanted a single image of how total the destruction was, it was that. A lake covered in the bones of the woods that used to surround it. What was left, in the days after, looked like the surface of another planet. Photographs from the time show a vast gray nothing. Hills of ash and pumice stretching to the horizon. Dead trees laid flat in endless parallel rows. Not a hint of green anywhere. It was one of the most thoroughly destroyed landscapes anyone had ever studied. And that is exactly why it became one of the most important natural experiments in the history of science. Because researchers realized they were being handed something rare and precious. A chance to watch, from the very first day, how life reclaims a place that has been wiped clean. Almost everyone assumed they knew the basic answer already. The prevailing idea was straightforward. A place this devastated becomes a blank slate, a sterile surface, and life has to arrive from outside. Seeds would blow in from distant surviving forests. Animals would wander in from the living edges. Recovery would be a slow invasion from the outside inward, colonizing the dead zone gradually over a very long time, starting at the green boundary and working toward the center. It was neat, logical, and widely believed. And then the actual mountain refused to follow the script, because when biologists got out onto that gray ash plain and really searched, they started finding survivors, not newcomers arriving from far away, survivors. Living things that had been right there, inside the blast zone, on the day of the eruption, and had somehow lived through it. The catastrophe, it turned out, had not been perfectly complete. It had been patchy, in a way no one had appreciated, and in those patches, life had hung on in the most unlikely hiding places. Here is where it gets genuinely strange, and if a story about life clawing its way back from total destruction is what you came for, take a moment to subscribe, because the identity of the creature doing the most to bring this dead mountain back is the last thing you would ever guess. Think about the timing of the eruption. It happened in spring, and in the high country around the mountain, that meant some areas were still under a thick layer of winter snow when the blast hit. That snow acted like a shield. In places, plants and small creatures underneath the snowpack were protected from the worst of the heat and the scouring, buried beneath a cold blanket while devastation passed over the top. When the snow later melted, living plants and roots were revealed underneath, alive, in the middle of a landscape everyone had written off as sterile. The same thing happened underground, and this is where the unlikely hero comes in. Not a mighty animal, a small burrowing rodent called the pocket gopher. On the day of the eruption, pocket gophers were doing what they always do, living in tunnels beneath the surface. When the blast flattened everything above, the gophers deep in their burrows were sheltered by the very earth around them. They survived underground while the world above was destroyed. And then they did something that turned out to be quietly miraculous for the whole recovery. They kept digging. As gophers tunnel, they push soil up to the surface. In the blast zone, that meant they were bringing up old, living soil from below, soil full of nutrients, seeds, roots, fungi, and microbes, and mixing it with the dead gray ash and pumice lying on top. Every gopher, going about its ordinary business, was acting like a tiny farmer, plowing buried life back up into the sterile surface, seeding little patches of fertility across the ash. Studies later showed that the ground where gophers had been active recovered dramatically faster than the ground where they had not. An animal most people would dismiss as a garden pest became one of the great engineers of the recovery of Mount Saint Helens. What makes the gopher story so powerful is how completely it inverts our instincts about who matters in a disaster. We imagine recovery being led by something grand and resilient, a great tree, a powerful animal. Instead, one of the true heroes of Mount Saint Helens was a creature that spends its life unseen, in the dark, moving dirt. It did not survive because it was strong. It survived because it was underground at the right moment, and then its most ordinary habit, digging, happened to be exactly what a poisoned surface needed. Nature did not send in a champion. It was rescued, in large part, by an accident of where a small rodent happened to be standing when the sky fell. The survivors did not stop there. In some of the lakes, fish and other water life had been under ice, or deep enough to make it through. Insects that had been dormant lived, roots and bulbs sprouted, seeds that had been buried germinated. Everywhere researchers looked, the recovery was being driven not mainly by life invading from outside, but by life that had been there all along, hidden underground, under snow, under ice, and had survived the unsurvivable. Scientists gave these survivors a name. They called them biological legacies. The living pieces left behind after a disaster, carried through the catastrophe in protected pockets, that become the seeds of everything that follows. Mount Saint Helens showed, more clearly than anywhere before, that a devastated landscape is almost never the perfect blank slate people imagine. It is haunted by survivors, and those survivors do most of the work. And then there was the question the whole world seemed to be asking. What actually grew back first? Out on the most barren ground of all, the open pumice plains where almost nothing had survived. And the answer surprised even the experts. One of the first plants to take hold on that bare, nutrient-poor pumice was a small, low, purple flowering plant called the prairie lupin. It seems far too delicate for the job, but the lupine has a hidden power. Like other plants in its family, it can take nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the soil, working with bacteria on its roots to fertilize the very ground it grows in. On a lifeless plain of pumice, where there were almost no nutrients at all, the lupine could survive where other plants could not. And as it grew and died, it began to build soil, adding nitrogen and organic matter, creating small islands of fertility. Those little lupine patches became nurseries. Once a lupine had enriched a patch of ground, other plants could get a foothold there. Insects came to the flowers. Dead lupines fed the soil. Each patch spread outward and joined with others, and step by step, plant by plant, the bare pumice began to turn green from countless tiny starting points scattered across the plain, not just from the distant edges. A fragile purple wildflower was quietly terraforming a volcanic wasteland. Now it is important to be honest about what this recovery is and is not, because the real story is more careful than a simple tale of instant healing. The land around Mount Saint Helens has come back to life in a way that genuinely astonished the scientists who expected a slow crawl from the edges. But it has not become, in a few decades, the mature forest it once was, and it will not for a very long time. What has returned is a young, wild, messy, living landscape, full of flowers, shrubs, young trees, insects, birds, and mammals. But the towering old-growth forest that stood before the blast takes centuries to grow. Recovery here is measured in different stages. Life came back fast. A full, mature forest is still generations away. The recovery has also been uneven, and in some ways that unevenness is the most important lesson of all. Some areas bounce back quickly because survivors happen to be there. Other areas, scoured more completely, or without those lucky pockets of life, recovered far more slowly. The difference often came down to chance, to whether a patch of snow, a gopher burrow, or a few buried seeds happened to be in exactly the right place on exactly that morning. Recovery was not one smooth process. It was a patchwork, written by luck and by survivors. And there is a deeper point in that, one that reaches well beyond a single volcano. For a long time, people pictured nature bouncing back from disaster as a clean, orderly march of new life moving in from outside. Mount Saint Helens replaced that tidy picture with something wilder and more surprising. It showed that even after near-total destruction, life is rarely completely erased. It hides, it survives underground, under snow, under ice, in cracks the catastrophe missed. And when the danger passes, it comes back, not as a neat invasion from the edges, but as an explosion of survivors emerging from within, each one a thread that was never fully cut. The animals came back in the same surprising way, part survival and part return. Elk, the big deer of the region, began moving back onto the blast zone remarkably early, wandering out across the open ground and grazing the new plants as they appeared. As they moved through, they churned the soil with their hooves, carried seeds in their fur and their droppings, and helped spread life even further across the plain. What had looked like a barren gray desert slowly filled with tracks, then with grazing herds, then with the predators and birds that follow them. Fireweed, a tall plant famous for blazing across burned ground with bright pink flowers, swept over disturbed areas. Spiders and insects blew in on the wind and colonized the ash. Piece by piece, the food web rebuilt itself, from the soil upward. Today, if you stand where that gray wasteland once stretched to the horizon, you do not see a dead moonscape. You see wildflowers running across the old pumice plains, young trees rising among the fallen giants, elk grazing where nothing moved, birds calling over ground that was once silent and buried. The mountain itself is scarred and changed forever, a great crater where the smooth cone used to be. But the land around it is alive, loud, and growing, far sooner than anyone dared to predict. A mountain blew itself apart, and the world assumed it had killed everything, and that recovery would take a lifetime to even begin. Instead, the first life to return was already there, waiting underground and under the snow, and it was led back not by anything mighty, but by burrowing rodents plowing old soil to the surface, and a small purple flower quietly fertilizing a volcanic desert. The thing that shocked every scientist was not just how fast the mountain came back to life, it was that the life had never entirely left. If you enjoy true stories of the wild pulled back from the very edge, stories most people never hear, then like this video and subscribe. In the next one, we will follow another place the world had already given up on. Take care of yourself and stay curious.